Undercover boss orders breakfast special, freezes when the waitress says her rent is overdue. Under the soft morning sunlight filtering through the trees along the main boulevard, Miles Hartleith, legendary founder of the Sunrise restaurant chain, stood silently before the glass door of the very first branch. This was the place where, 20 years ago, he had personally wiped down every table, baked the very first batches of pancakes, and nurtured the dream of a brand that would bring warmth and light to everyone. But now, standing before the faded sign, dulled by time, his heart grew heavy. Recently, financial reports had still arrived regularly, full of dreamlike figures and flowery promises that everything was under control. But what lay behind those reports? Revenue had quietly declined, staff turnover had risen abnormally, and customers had become scarce, their complaints unending. Miles clenched his fists, his gaze slowly sweeping over the familiar scene that suddenly felt so foreign. He made a decision. There would be no more boardroom meetings high above the city, no more sugar-coated reports. He needed the truth seen with his own eyes, heard with his own ears. Throwing on his old worn jacket and pulling down the brim of a faded cap to conceal his familiar appearance, Miles entered Sunrise Diner as a complete stranger. Using a false name, he chose a seat tucked away from sight where no corner of the restaurant, no sound, no whispered conversation could escape his watchful eyes. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily. The faint aroma of coffee drifted in the air, but somehow the scent lacked the rich, welcoming warmth of the old days. And in that very moment, his journey to uncover the hidden corners behind Sunrise's polished exterior officially began. The coffee cup still steamed, its gentle warmth rising into the cool morning air, but Miles Hartleith's heart grew colder with every word he accidentally overheard. Seated at a small corner table near the kitchen area, Miles quietly tasted the breakfast speciale golden omelet alongside a slice of buttered toast. This meal had once been a symbol of pride, the emblem of his early entrepreneurial passion. But today, every bite felt dry, every flavor oddly hollow and unfamiliar. Suddenly, from behind a thin partition near the coffee counter, a hushed voice drifted over. It was the waitress who had just served him, her tone weary, as if a confession were being forced from the depths of her heart. "I still haven't paid this month's rent. If I'm late again, they'll probably cut the electricity." A tired, brittle sigh followed, then a broken sentence. "Still no sign of our wages. And we're forced to put our tips into the common fund. Everyone back in the kitchen is struggling just like me." Miles felt as if someone had just slammed a heavy blow into his chest. His hand froze, the scalding hot coffee cup in his grip now numb to the pain. All those beautiful numbers on the reports, the confident assurances from the management team that everything is fine, in the end, they were nothing but a flimsy curtain hiding a bitter truth. He looked up and caught sight of the small, frail figure of that young girl as she turned back toward the counter. Her slender shoulders trembled with each heavy breath. The faint smile she had worn earlier while carrying the coffee tray now existed only in memory, replaced by a worn-out figure and eyes clouded with worry. How many things have I lost sight of all these years? That silent question echoed in Miles's mind, sparking a fierce resolve. He had to dig deeper, had to touch the very core of the pain hidden beneath the glamorous facade called Sunrise. And at that moment, the journey to uncover the truth truly began. In the days that followed, Miles Hartleith was no longer the CEO buried in polished reports within a high-rise office. He returned to Sunrise Diner as a nameless stranger, quietly stepping through the dusty old glass doors during hours he had never cared to notice before. At dawn, when the city was still half asleep, under the blazing noon sun streaming through dusty windows, and in the late afternoons when the restaurant lights flickered weakly, exhausted just like the people behind the counters. And with each visit, another raw, painful truth revealed itself bare, impossible to hide any longer. 10 a.m., cold storage warehouse. Miles stood quietly in a dark corner where the weak light couldn't reach. Right before his eyes, Garethi branch manager he had once trusted was shaking hands tightly with an unfamiliar supplier. A thick envelope exchanged hands smoothly, as if it were a long-standing habit. In return came boxes of cheap pancake flour, peeling labels, and bottles of syrup so thin they were nearly transparent. He clenched his fist tightly, his jaw locked. The dishes that had once been his pride, that built the very name of Sunrise, were now being trampled on without a second thought in shady deals like this. Noon, main hall under pressure. The restaurant began to fill with customers. Miles sat silently in a hidden corner, his eyes following each plate as it was served. The famous breakfast speciale meal he had once perfected down to the last buttered toast had become nothing but dry, lifeless pancakes overwhelmed by the raw taste of flour. The coffee was watery, the omelet falling apart and greasy, no longer the bright golden hue it once was. Complaints echoed nonstop through the dining area. Is this really how bad Sunrise has become? This is supposed to be their signature dish? Gary, standing behind the register, merely shrugged and smirked before disappearing again into his office. The young staff did their best to hold on to their forced smiles, their trembling hands struggling to endure the angry stares of dissatisfied customers. Late afternoon, quiet backyard corner. Miles walked out behind the restaurant and came to a sudden halt. In the shaded corner of the steps, Leneath Waitress with that faint, fragile smile sat huddled, clutching half a hard, dry baguette, eating in hurried bites, as if trying to fill the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. In her trembling hands was a crumpled rent notice, the red overdue figures glaring brutally at her. On the screen of her old phone, a chilling notification blinked like a cold knife to the heart. Power cut notice, effective tomorrow. She let out a faint sigh and quickly wiped away the tear that had just fallen. Then, as if it was an ingrained reflex born from long hardship, she stood up, straightened her faded apron, and stepped back into the restaurant. And just like that, the smile returned to her lips gentle, as if sorrow had never dared to touch her. The CEO's state of mind, a blow straight to the heart. Miles stood still for a long time, his eyes stinging, his fists clenched unconsciously. In that moment, he saw himself clearly a man who had once promised to create a dignified, humane workplace, now witnessing the very people he vowed to protect, completely drained beneath the roof bearing the name Sunrise. Those budget tightening plans, the cold, calculated decisions signed off in lavish boardroom, she realized they had unwittingly turned his beautiful dream into a waking nightmare for people like Lena. The dawn that Sunrise had once proudly spoken of, when had it turned into such a bleak, cold gray? And in that very moment, Miles understood. If he didn't stand up to change things starting right now, then Sunrise would become nothing more than a forgotten name, buried alongside the abandoned dreams lost in the shadows. He stood there for a long while, each breath heavy, weighed down by the crushing burden of all the years he had strayed from his founding values. His gaze landed unintentionally on the faded Sunrise Diner sign above the old brick wall. Years ago, he had stood under that very sign, sweat streaming down his brow, his hands trembling with joy as he flipped the very first pancakes. And now, the aroma that once tugged at countless hearts was nothing more than the faint, stale scent of cheap flour lingering in the air. A light breeze swept through the back alley, lifting the crumpled rent notice from Lena's hand. The paper fluttered gently to Miles' feet and settled there like a harsh, undeniable reminder. He bent down and picked it up, his eyes locked onto the bold, italicized red text. Payment due by the 5th or eviction will proceed. He turned back and saw Lena hastily fixing her hair, her slight shoulders trembling softly from exhaustion. Yet those eyes, though burdened with countless worries still, held a faint glimmer of light, like the last ray of sunshine breaking through the heavy clouds at day's end. Miles buried his hands deep into his pockets, his chest tightening with a wave of overwhelming emotion. For the first time after years of chasing billion-dollar deals, he finally understood the true cost of indifference. It wasn't the red negative figures on financial reports, it was the extinguished smiles, the forgotten dreams, people like Lena struggling to survive under the very roof he once swore would be a place where each day began with hope. At that moment, a decision rang out clearly in his mind, without hesitation, without calculation. Tomorrow, Sunrise must start over, and this time, it must truly shine. That morning, Sunrise Diner felt like a tightly strung wire. Rumors of a special event had everyone on edge. At exactly 9 a.m., the grand doors swung open. Bathed in the flood of light from the lobby, Miles Hartley stepped inside. Gone was the worn-out coat and quiet demeanor. Before them stood the dignified, commanding founder, dressed immaculately in a sharp suit. On his chest, under the lights, his name tag gleamed. Miles Hartley, CEO, founder, Sunrise Restaurant Group. The air seemed to freeze in that moment. Garithi branch manager stood rooted in place, his face pale as a sheet. Lena, the girl whose fragile smile had become a symbol of silent suffering, stood motionless by the register, her hands clutching a tattered cleaning rag, her eyes brimming with tears. Miles strode slowly to the center of the room. His voice rang out deep, steady, yet piercing every heart present. Sunrise was created to bring hope with each new day. But today, I stand here to witness how that very dream has been suffocated by greed and neglect. He gestured toward the tech team. The large screen lit up, and the damning footage played in absolute silence. Gary, casually accepting a thick envelope from a supplier. Crates of cheap, substandard ingredients being delivered to the warehouse. Gary's cold, emotionless voice. The internal fund must be paid. Otherwise, forget about the good shifts. And finally, the heartbreaking scene of Lena, curled up in the warehouse corner, chewing on a dry piece of bread, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the unpaid rent notice. On her phone screen, the harsh, blinking warning, "Power cut scheduled, effective tomorrow." The entire room fell silent, a suffocating stillness, as if the weight of 1,000 stones pressed down on every chest. Miles turned, his eyes sharp as blades, locking onto Gary. "Gary, do you have anything to say before I sign your termination papers right here and now?" Gary stammered, his forehead glistening with sweat. I was only following the cost-cutting policy, sir." Miles cut him off sharply, his voice ringing out like a resounding wake-up call. "Cutting costs does not mean strangling human dignity. You are fired, effective immediately. And to anyone who has aided in this injustice, you may stand and leave this place right now." Several lower-level managers hung their heads low and quietly left the meeting room. Every step they took left behind a heavy emptiness not easily filled. At that moment, Miles slowly approached Lena. His voice softened, his eyes filled with a deep, inescapable sorrow. "Lena, after everything you've endured, why didn't you leave?" Lena took a deep breath, a faint but resilient smile blooming on her pale face. Her eyes sparkled as she spoke, every word resonating deep in the hearts of everyone present. "Because I still believe that one day this place will truly feel warm, like the family breakfast we all used to dream about." In that moment, Miles felt his heart tighten. He took out a bank card and gently placed it into Lena's trembling hands. "This holds $50,000, enough for you to take care of your family and continue pursuing the dreams you've left unfinished. This is not a gift, it's an investment in your resilience and dignity. Are you ready to take the next step, Lena?" Lena broke into tears. But this time, they were no longer tears of sorrow, they were tears of hope, of a brand new beginning. Miles turned to face everyone. His voice rang out like a solemn oath. "From this moment on, Lena is officially enrolled in Sunrise's Executive Management Training Program. We are not just here to serve breakfast, we are here to serve dreams, to reignite forgotten hopes. And I promise you all, the true dawn of Sunrise begins right now." The room erupted in thunderous applause. For the first time in a long while, Sunrise Diner felt alive again, not just with the light of morning, but with hearts rediscovering their faith in a brighter tomorrow. The applause seemed to last forever in that space, once filled only with the quiet clinking of spoons and the weary sighs of exhaustion. But today, in that very moment, each person felt as though they had shed years of sorrow, their eyes shining with a hope they hadn't dared believe they'd ever feel again. Miles allowed a soft smile to curve his lips. For the first time in so many years, that smile wasn't for profit reports or rising revenue charts, it was for the people standing tall before him, the very people he had once forgotten amidst tense board meetings and billion-dollar deals. The Sunrise Reborn Reform Plan was presented immediately after, each provision resounding like an oath of honor: comprehensive welfare enhancement for employees, from a livable base salary, expanded health insurance, to emergency financial aid and scholarships for employees' children, absolute transparency in tips and benefit sharing. All tips will be publicly disclosed and directly transferred to the deserving staff. The ambiguous concept of internal funds will be permanently abolished. Rebuilding corporate culture based on 3 pillars: respect, kindness, integrity. Every employee at Sunrise must be heard, understood, and given the opportunity to develop themselves. Because only when people are truly happy can a business truly thrive. When everything quieted down, Miles quietly left the main hall. He slowly walked up to the rooftop, the small corner where, many years ago, he had stood to witness the very first sunrise of the Sunrise Empire. Now, standing before the large window, his gaze swept over the bustling diner below. Sunrise Diner today was not just crowded, it was filled with joyous laughter. Golden, fragrant pancakes were continuously brought out. The coffee machines hummed in harmony like a happy symphony. At the service counter, Lena, now wearing her new uniform, stood tall and proud. Her name badge gleamed: Lena Collins, Assistant General Manager. She stood before the new staff members, her voice ringing with inspiration. "I used to think that if I just endured, everything would eventually pass. But Sunrise today has taught me, don't just wait, dare to stand up, dare to believe, and seize the opportunity. We all deserve our own sunrise. and you are the ones who will light that dawn." Another round of applause echoed throughout the space, blending with the sweet scent of pancakes and the soft morning sunlight pouring through the windows. Miles gently closed his eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in so many years, his heart was no longer burdened by numbers, but filled with warmth and peace. He whispered softly, as if to himself, a vow etched deeply in his soul. This is the sunrise I always dreamed of." That morning, Sunrise Diner welcomed not only the first light of a new day, but also a new energy, one filled with hope and love. The old walls still stood. The familiar wooden tables and chairs had yet to be replaced. But in the air, in every glance, every smile, everything had changed. In the main hall, under the warm golden lights, Miles Hartley stood before the entire staff and solemnly announced the comprehensive reform program named Sunrise Reborn. From today, Sunrise Diner will not only be the place where a new day begins, but the place where new lives are started, where each person can live, work, and be proud of who they are. Oh, applause thundered like a drum roll, signaling a new beginning, and in everyone's hearts, silent hopes that had long lain dormant were rekindled. Miles raised his voice, each word etched deep into the hearts of everyone present. Comprehensive welfare enhancement. Every employee at Sunrise Diner will now receive a livable wagino, more sleepless nights, worrying about unpaid bills. Health insurance coverage will be expanded, and an official scholarship program for employees' children is launched. Absolute transparency in tips and benefits. All tips will be openly disclosed and handed directly to those who deserve them. There will no longer be any room for ambiguous internal funds. No more sweat exchanged in vain. Rebuilding company culture on the pillars of respect, kindness, integrity. At Sunrise, people don't just work for a living, they find value, rediscover pride, and live with true dignity. In the front row, Lynette, a woman who once quietly wiped away tears in the back storage room, now stood tall, her eyes sparkling with pride. On her chest, her name badge gleamed under the lights. Lena Collins, Assistant General Manager. UA. She stepped onto the stage, her voice echoing through the hall, eyes fixed on the young faces just beginning their journey. "I once only dared to hope, but today, I dared to believe and stood up to change my fate. And you never lose faith in yourselves. Remember, the sunrise doesn't come from a fair, it begins from the brave hearts within each of us." Applause thundered once again, but this time it carried with it understanding, gratitude, and a burning desire for change. On the rooftop, Miles stood quietly by the large window, his hands in his pockets. His eyes followed the lively scene below. Laughter filled the air. The sweet aroma of pancakes wafted up with the early morning breeze, carrying the familiar scent of days long past, but this time, sweeter, fuller, more complete. Miles gently closed his eyes, took a deep breath, then opened them to gaze at the dawning sky. His warm, deep voice softly echoed, as if sending a message to himself and to all those who had ever lost their way. This is the sunrise I've always dreamed of." Down in the main hall, fresh bouquets hurriedly arranged that morning, now bloomed brilliantly, their soft fragrances filling the warm space. The old wall clock ticked steadily, marking the beginning of a new chapter for Sunrise Diner. All eyes turned to the stage, where Miles Hartley, founder, the man who once sowed the very first seeds of hope, was now writing an entirely new chapter in that journey. His voice rose again, calm yet powerful. "I once believed that building a mighty empire was enough. But no, my friends, only when we build a family, a place where everyone finds kindness, pride, and their own light will Sunrise truly be complete." Oh, he slowly stepped down, walking past each row of seats, his eyes meeting faces once worn with hardship, now shining with new hope. Then he stopped and offered Lena, now dressed in her pristine manager's uniform, a proud handshake. The entire hall erupted in prolonged applause. Lena, her voice now strong yet filled with heartfelt emotion, continued her story. "Perhaps in my darkest days, I once thought that simply enduring was enough. But then, it was all of you, those who smiled despite exhaustion, those who kept trying even when your tips were barely enough, that taught me we deserve more than just survival. Today, I don't stand here just for myself. I stand for all of us, to make Sunrise truly a place where every day begins with hope and ends with happiness." The crowd fell silent before bursting into waves of applause mixed with soft sobs. It wasn't just encouragement, it was a sigh of relief after countless days of struggle, a joyful cheer from people who had finally rediscovered themselves. On the rooftop, where the morning breeze gently swept through the wide-open windows, Miles Hartley stood in silence, his gaze resting on the crowd below. The sunlight bathed every radiant face, every seat now filled with laughter, warm greetings, and the sweet scent of freshly made pancakes swirling through the air, just like the early days when he stood behind the counter, personally making each pancake for his very first customers. He closed his eyes gently, letting the breeze tousle his silvered hair, his breaths flowing softly along with the mellow music drifting up from the hall below. And in that very moment, he whispered not just to himself, but as if speaking to all who had, are, and will one day walk through the doors of this home called Sunrise. This is the sunrise I've always dreamed of. You can build a magnificent empire, but if you forget the value of humanity, it's nothing more than a castle built on sand. A truly sustainable business isn't built on dazzling numbers, but on hearts that have been warmed, dreams that have been rekindled, and lives that have found happiness again because of you. For in the end, success isn't measured by profit, but by how many people have found faith, light, and hope again for a brighter tomorrow.